The ghosts of men and women fill the wards of government hospitals across India. They stare silently, suspended in limbo between the living and the dead. These patients are the infected, victims of a contagion so lethal it kills almost 1.5 million people globally every year and infects a further 9 million. Despite an arsenal of drugs, tuberculosis is making a devastating resurgence in one of the world's most populated countries.
TB continues to kill 2 Indians every 3 minutes. It's a staggering figure, one that would cause outrage in any European country or in the United States of America, but which is just accepted as par for the course in this country.
For decades, the Indian government has wrestled with this epidemic, introducing a nationwide free treatment program for the poorest and most vulnerable. But instead of killing the bacteria, doctors say misdiagnosis and incomplete treatments have allowed TB to thrive like never before.
The germs are becoming smarter. They are becoming resistant to the antibiotics that have been around for 50 years. When someone who has tuberculosis is not treated appropriately or doesn't completely consume the medicines that they've been prescribed, they have a likelihood of going on to become drug resistant.
I'm Karishma Vyas, and on 101's This Week, we're in India, where a deadly mutant strain of tuberculosis is spreading across the country. In the shadows of India's capital, New Delhi, Anju Kashyap quietly battles her demons. Her frail body is being ravaged by tuberculosis. Both her lungs are infected, and she's on a cocktail of pills and injections to stay alive. For 10 years, Anju has been fighting the illness, but the drugs haven't worked. She's seen more than a dozen doctors and swallowed thousands of prescription pills in the hope of a cure. Instead of the vibrant young woman she once was, Anju is now skin and bone, weighing just 29 kilos.
जब तो ये था कि टीबी है बस 6 महीने की दवाई है खाऊंगी ठीक हो जाऊंगी 6 महीने की दवाई खाई नहीं ठीक हुई फिर 6 महीने की खाई फिर ठीक मतलब बार-बार रूटीन से खा ही रही थी कुछ फर्क ही नहीं हो रहा था कुछ आराम ही नहीं हो रहा था एक बार नहीं 2 बार नहीं कई बार खा ली 3-4 बार आराम ही नहीं होता अब लास्ट पे हूँ
Anju remembers her mother dying of tuberculosis when she was a child. Just a few years after this family photo was taken. 3 of her 4 brothers and sisters have since become sick. While they've recovered with treatment, Anju has become worse. She's deeply religious, but is losing faith in herself.
मैंने दुख में भगवान को कभी नहीं पूछा दुख में यूँ नहीं पूछता कि दुनिया पूछती है बस ये आस रहती है कि बस भगवान तुम्हारे ऊपर ही है ठीक कर देना आपके ऊपर ही है करो तो पूरी तरह ठीक कर दो ये नहीं फिर बीच में लटका दो करो तो पूरी तरह ठीक करो ये नहीं करना तो एक बार उठा लो
Anju is not alone in her fight for survival against TB. Millions of people are infected worldwide, nowhere more so than here in India. Tuberculosis has been around for millennia. In the Middle Ages, it was called consumption, and it killed 2/3 of people infected before modern medicine was invented in the 1940s. But despite our advances in medicine and technology, we've never quite managed to eradicate it. In fact, today, 1/3 of the world's population carries the TB bacteria. I know I do, and the chances are that you or the person sitting next to you does too. Plagued by poverty, poor hygiene and population density, TB has taken a ferocious foothold in India. According to the World Health Organization, there are 2 million new infections here every year. A further 300,000 people die. The fundamental problem is that there is no way to stop people from becoming infected.
Tuberculosis is a bacteria that causes pneumonia, a lung infection. And when someone who has a lung disease from tuberculosis coughs, they create airborne particles, little tiny microscopic water droplets that contain bacteria and remain suspended in the air for a long period of time, as long as 24 hours. When some other person inhales one of those particles, they get deposited in the lungs where the bacteria grow and proliferate, essentially unchecked by the immune system for a period of weeks to a month. And during that time, the immune system starts to develop a response and is able to wall off the bacteria. The vast majority of people will live their entire life in that condition of being infected but not sick. But in about 10% of patients, the balance between the aggressive properties of the bacteria and the defensive properties of the host get out of tune, and the bacteria will reactivate, wake up and cause disease, generally in the lungs. That person will start coughing and the cycle repeats itself.
With preventing infections impossible, health professionals focus on treating active TB, with medication developed more than 40 years ago. But in the 1990s, doctors globally began to notice strange mutations in the bacteria. The TB germs were becoming immune to the medication. It started with resistance to 1 or 2 drugs. These patients have what's called multi-drug resistant or MDR TB. It is curable. It then increased to more drugs. The health community calls this extensively drug-resistant or XDR TB. The treatments are much longer and more toxic, but again, there is hope. But by 2011, doctors in Italy, Iran and India were seeing a terrifying trend. Health professionals from across the country were becoming increasingly concerned by patients who were simply not responding to traditional TB medicine. But it was doctors in Mumbai's Hinduja hospital that finally began putting the pieces of this puzzle together. In 2011, they wrote a report for an international science journal that sent shockwaves through the medical community and the government. They reported India's first cases of totally drug-resistant TB.
The first patient I will never forget, because she was a lady who came to us from Uttar Pradesh. She trekked across 2 major states in India at distances 1,000 kilometers apart.
Through extensive laboratory tests, Dr. Jazeera Udwadia and his team discovered the patient was resistant to all TB drugs available on the market. Not only did this mutant strain have no known cure, like other forms of TB, it was also highly contagious.
For the first time, a patient who was resistant across the ball to all 12 of the first and second line drugs we used to treat TB. So, I mean, if that's not totally drug resistant, what is? In quick succession, around the same time, I had 3 more cases. Different parts of the country and the city, not all from one cluster, for example, or from one neighborhood, all of whom had the identical pattern.
The government's first reaction to Dr. Udwadia's findings was to try to contain this new strain of TB. There was talk of quarantine and of widening the net for diagnosis. But then something changed. Instead of attacking the illness, officials began attacking the doctors. The staff at Hinduja Hospital were accused of spreading panic amongst the public. The government questioned the quality of their laboratory, and the WHO refused to recognize the term totally drug-resistant TB calling it misleading because an effective new drug could emerge in the near future.
We were surprised, we were a bit hurt by the government's response because they cast aspersions on me, on the hospital, on the laboratory. And I must say that we had the backing of the hospital, which was really wonderful here, and they stood by us. Our lab, as I said earlier, is really probably one of the finest in the country. And probably in terms of sheer numbers of samples, it receives one of the most experienced in the world. But yet there were aspersions cast on all of us. The samples were taken again for analysis by the government, the original 4 samples from the original 4 patients. And they were taken to the main government public lab where they were reanalyzed, which was fine by us because we were confident about our results being authentic. And yes, I was quite shaken up and a bit alarmed at the response because they seemed to be shooting the messenger instead of listening to the message.
The immediate rejection of Dr. Udwadi's findings surprised many in the medical community. Some believe it was because his report inadvertently exposed the government's and the WHO's failure to control TB in India.
I think the reaction has much to do with the contrasting images of India that are portrayed abroad. One is of India shining with its technology and economic progress on the other hand, and then being the disease capital of several diseases that affect mankind. So I think that sort of contrast sets about some sort of an ego problem in the government, and I think the denial is a part of that behavior.
Dr. Nergis Mistry specializes in drug-resistant tuberculosis at the privately funded Foundation for Medical Research in Mumbai. She says Dr. Udwadi's report on totally drug-resistant TB was far from controversial.
This term had been used in previous conferences when TDR patients were reported both in Italy as well as in Iran. At that time, nobody objected to, even the WHO didn't object to the use of the word, to the terminology TDR. So it was surprising that when the news broke in Bombay or Mumbai, that's when everyone got really on a high horse about it, particularly those that were threatened by this revelation.
Despite repeated requests for an interview, India's Minister for Health and the head of the country's TB program said they were unavailable. So to find out how this mutant strain of TB emerged in India, despite the government's multi-million-dollar control efforts, we went to ground zero of the epidemic. This is Govandi slum in the south of Mumbai. It has one of the highest caseloads of TB in the city. And if you look around, it's not difficult to tell why. Water quality and sanitation are extremely poor, and people are literally living on top of one another. It's the perfect place for a contagion like TB to spread. Govandi is built next to the largest waste dumping site in the city. For the people who live here, there's little access to quality food or hygiene, allowing TB to spread mercilessly through the community. But it's also where the government's TB program is in full swing. This centre is part of a 400,000-strong network of state-funded facilities built to diagnose, treat and monitor the poorest TB patients. It's a critical part of the government's revised national tuberculosis program, designed by the World Health Organization in the 1990s. Spit and mucus samples from local residents are tested for TB. If they're positive, patients must come here several times a week or even daily to take the free prescribed medication in front of a health worker. That's why the program is called Directly Observed Treatment Short Course, or DOTS. Health workers are meant to personally observe each patient taking their medicine to ensure the treatment is consumed on time and the course completed. If this is not done, the bacteria can become drug resistant. The program is one of the largest public health interventions in the world. According to official figures, more than 14 million TB patients have been treated since 1998 and at least 2 million lives saved. The numbers are impressive, but on the ground, cracks are appearing in the system. Misdiagnosis of TB is rife in India, and the problems start right here. This microscopy test is 125 years old. It's slow, it's laborious, and it's extremely inaccurate. Health professionals estimate that it misses 50% of TB cases. A grim statistic worsened by the 1 in 3 TB patients who fail to complete their treatments.
फिर उनको थोड़ा अच्छा लगने लगता है, तो ऐसा लगने लगता है कि अभी टीबी की तकलीफ हमको कुछ नहीं है, तो छोड़ देते हैं दवा. अगर समझो टेम्पररी दवा लेने से उनको थोड़ा अच्छे लगने लगता है, तो बोलता है उनको ऐसा लगने लगता है कि टीबी ख़त्म हो गई है हमारे शरीर से, लेकिन ऐसा होता नहीं है. उसकी तो दवा 6 से 8 महीना आपको लेना ही है.
We went to visit just such a patient. कैसे हो आप जी? Thank you. कैसे हो? आप ठीक हो? Sardar Kasim Sheikh was prescribed 6 months of TB medicine, but stopped after just 3 weeks.
दवा इसीलिए बंद किया, तो दवा खाने के बाद में उल्टी होता है और जो बलगम है ना उसके अंदर खून आता है, हाथ पैर दर्द होते हैं, हाथ पैर की कमजोरी हो गई है और चलने फिरने को उठने की तकलीफ होती है.
He doesn't know it, but by dropping out of his treatment, Sardar is allowing the TB bacteria in his body to regroup and build resistance against the drugs he's already taken. There are tens of thousands of patients like Sardar in India, unwittingly acting as incubators for a more virulent strain of tuberculosis. While the government is not to blame for this, doctors say that it is failing to respond effectively to the increasing numbers of drug-resistant patients. Some even suggest that the national TB program is fueling drug resistance through misdiagnosis and the prescription of wrong medication. Back in New Delhi, Anju attends yet another doctor's appointment. She's been struggling with TB for years through the halls of government hospitals, but no treatment has worked. It wasn't until we accompanied her to the appointment that the doctor explained why she wasn't getting better.
मुझे ये लगता है कि जो आपकी मदर थी उनको एक टीबी की लंबी बीमारी थी और हो सकता है कि उनको एमडीआर की बीमारी रही हो, क्योंकि आप 3-4 साल, जैसे आपको तो 8-10 साल हो गए, 3-4 साल आपको याद है, उससे ज़्यादा ही आप कह रहे हो कि रहा होगा, तो हो सकता है कि उनको भी एमडीआर की बीमारी रही हो. तो एक कारण तो ये हो सकता है कि वो जो एमडीआर की बीमारी है उनसे आपको लगी हो.
Given this history, Anju should have been tested for multi-drug resistant TB from the very beginning and put on the appropriate drug regime for 2 years. Instead, she was medicated for typhoid and given 6-month prescriptions to treat standard TB on at least 2 occasions, drugs that could have helped the bacteria mutate even further. Anju can only afford public hospitals for most of her treatment. Misdiagnosis and mismanagement of TB patients are not uncommon here, but the private sector is often no better. The vast majority of doctors and specialists in India today work in private practice. This ranges from top-notch hospitals to unqualified practitioners who are indiscriminately medicating TB patients. The damage they're doing is incalculable, because around 60% of people here will first go to a private doctor for treatment. Their opening hours are more convenient, and many believe the quality of care is better. But for the poor who are most affected by TB, the private doctors they can afford are likely to be the least qualified to treat them. Between overburdened public hospitals and unreliable private practitioners, tuberculosis has been allowed to mutate into the most virulent strain yet.
I think drug resistance is a wake-up call. that we need to get very serious about all forms of TB. Drug-susceptible tuberculosis is entirely treatable, and drug-resistant tuberculosis can be treated as well. But if we don't treat those cases well, then that's when we start to develop increasingly drug-resistant TB. And then we run the risk of having an airborne pathogen to which we have no treatment.
Dr. Peter Small from the Gates Foundation has been studying tuberculosis around the globe for decades and has seen the illness ravage countries like India. Like many, he believes the country suffers from a critical shortage of diagnostic facilities, labs that can determine whether a TB patient is drug resistant from the very beginning. Nationwide, the government has accredited just over 50 such labs, woefully inadequate for the 2 million new cases of tuberculosis identified here every year. But this little machine could change all that.
We now have a diagnostic test which can diagnose with certainty tuberculosis and tell you if it's resistant to antibiotics within 2 hours. This is truly transformational, that an unskilled laboratory worker can know for certainty if someone has tuberculosis.
The government has bought a number of these gene expert machines, and it's already revolutionizing treatment. Doctors can not only catch more TB cases, but they can prescribe the correct medication for drug resistance from the very beginning, dramatically increasing their chances of curing a patient. There has also been innovations in the development of new drugs. In December last year, the US Food and Drug Administration granted accelerated approval to release bedaquiline. It's the first new drug for TB patients in about 40 years, and it can treat drug resistance. Other medications are also in the pipeline, but they all come with a warning.
These new drugs are precious in that they are currently going to work against every germ in the world. But if we don't use them well, resistance will emerge to them as well.
These new drugs could be a lifeline for patients like Anju. She has now tested positive for extensively drug-resistant TB, which means that she's completely irresponsive to most of the medication currently available.
टेंशन तो है ही, खैर सबसे लास्ट स्टेज पे पहुंच गई मैं। शरीर में रह ही गया, ख़त्म हो गया सब कुछ। आगे के लिए फ्यूचर है ही नहीं कुछ सोचूं तो बस यह डिपेंड के बस जब तक जी रही हूँ तब तक जी रही हूँ।
Anju spends her days in severe pain as her body tries to fight the disease. But she worries most about the uncertainty of her future. After her mother passed away, it was Anju who held the family together, dropping out of school to work and raise her younger sisters. Now she can barely put on her shoes because of the drug's side effects.
बीमारी कितनी बड़ी भी हो, कुछ भी हो, कभी हार नहीं मानना चाहिए, लड़ते जाना चाहिए, क्यों कभी ना कभी तो कहीं ना कहीं तो हल होगा। बीमारी कहीं तो रुकेगी, ठीक नहीं होगी तो ख़त्म होएगी, कहीं तो ख़त्म होगी, एंड में तो कहीं तो जाएगी।